It's interesting, actually, what the questions that I was asked by the young people are the same types of questions I often get asked by young people. And I sometimes think that young people ask the question that adults are longing to ask. And they usually ask it rather more bluntly. But they will say, you know, why would you get involved in politics? Why would you be a politician? Particularly with the reputation that politicians have at the moment. It's not always... I'm not sure it's necessarily the greatest status job at the moment. I think you'd probably all agree. So what's the point? Why would you want to devote your life to it? And I say, well, there are lots of ways in which you can make a difference in the world. And I would say to young people, you know, you might decide that you want to be a doctor or a teacher, and you may be able to help one person. But the point about politics is that you can help many more people. And often that one person who has that problem, you'll find that problem everywhere. Lots of people will have the same problem. And politics is the only way in which you have that opportunity to change the system, have the opportunity to prevent something happening to other people coming after them. It's, if you like, not just dealing with suffering, but dealing with the causes of suffering, getting to the root, the thing that really is frustrating people and making a huge difference. Politics, I think, is whether or not you're active in politics or not. I would say to you, it's the vehicle for you making a difference in your community to the things that really matter to you. Whether or not that's about your children's school, whether or not it's about what's happening in your street, whether it's about what's happening in your neighbourhood, whether or not it's international politics that really fires you. It's things that are happening on the other side of the world that you've seen on the television. I know we have television cameras here today that are relaying some things on a number of different channels. Maybe it's what you watch on those channels that you think, that's the thing that really fires me. The way in which you change those things is to get active in politics and to be involved in politics. Politics is the vehicle for making that difference. And why would I join the Lib Dems? You know, we've got numerous parties you might choose to join. Another of the kinds of questions that I often get asked by young people. And for me, the reason I joined the party was fundamentally about people and the value of people and the worth of people. For me, that's a really fundamental issue, and the only party that for me understood and recognised what was really important to me, that there is something critical about common humanity that is worth valuing, that's worth promoting, that's worth protecting. Dignity of people is something which is really critical. The only party that ever came close to that for me was the Liberal Democrats. And those are the causes that have really fired me for all the time. I mean, I've been elected now for 10 years. I was elected in 2003, at that stage in a by-election that made the news because it was on the back of the Iraq War. It was just after Tony Blair invaded Iraq, and the Liberal Democrats then were in third place in Brent East. My previous seat was called Brent East. It's been renamed since then. And it was huge news then. It was the first time that the Labour Party had been defeated in an election like that. It is almost inconceivable to think now that in the last 5 years of the previous government, the previous Labour government, over 7,000 children were imprisoned in immigration detention centres who had committed no crime whatsoever. And they were held there sometimes for only a few days, but sometimes for weeks, sometimes for many months. And often people were picked up and their whole families were detained. They may detain for some period of time, not knowing when they'd be released, and then released again back into the community and then detained all over again. And the damage that was done to those young people in terms of their self-esteem, their psychological makeup, their mental health, their aspirations, their confidence, their schoolwork, the damage that was done to them was enormous. And there were many different reports that demonstrated this, that this was huge. It was really devastating for families. And it was an issue I felt very strongly about. I represent the most ethnically diverse constituency in the country. I knew people whose families had been detained in immigration detention centres. This was an issue that I felt really strongly about. You know, we can't just to automatically detain children as a route to try and deport their parents is simply not acceptable, especially given the damage that it does to children. So I got involved in campaigning on this issue in opposition, making common cause with Citizens UK, and of course some of you may know about Citizens UK, but Citizens UK are an organisation that work with local mosques, and they work with local churches, and they work with many local voluntary organisations to try and campaign on issues that matter in their local area. And they got very involved in lobbying senior politicians. And then when I was first appointed as a Minister for Children and Families in the Department for Education, it was a really important issue. I felt that we should deliver on that pledge. It had been a part of our manifesto, and I wanted to see us deliver. So I suppose one of the things I'm most proud of really is in my time in government is that I was the minister that fought to do that and delivered that. And now we no longer routinely pick up families and detain children en route to be deported. It doesn't happen like that anymore. We changed that policy. That was something I fought for in opposition, and it was something I was able to deliver in government. But that wasn't just about me. That was about all the different people who campaigned to make that possible. It was the people who lobbied their MPs, who made sure that every party considered this was important, that really lobbied my party to make sure that we made sure it was an absolute priority. So it was ordinary people who were involved in delivering that pledge. And then you'll hear from the Deputy Prime Minister later, and I worked incredibly closely with him to negotiate that. It's one thing to say that you want to do something. Believe me, in government, it's often a whole lot more difficult than that. And we had to fight extremely hard inside government to make sure that that was delivered and that we were able to end that practice. And it was something that we were able to do. And the second thing I want to talk about, which has been a really important cause for me, is around education and making sure that children and young people all have opportunities to fulfil their potential. It's staggering, really, still, that in this country the greatest predictor of how well you will do at school remains your parents' income. It's a shocking statistic, and it's something that I think it's a matter of shame for us, and to think that in this country that is still the case. And for many children, how well they will do later in life is almost already determined before they reach 3. So a bright child from a poor area in my constituency begins to fall behind a child born a couple of miles down the road at a very, very young age indeed, long before they begin school. Now, you might wonder why somebody like myself would take such an interest in this. I mean, I'm a kind of classic middle-class girl. I went to Cambridge. I got A grades at A-level. Why would this matter to me? Well, it matters to me partly because my educational background is a bit odd, probably. I was very, very sick when I was a teenager, and I missed 4 years of school. I spent most of my teenage years in a wheelchair, in and out of hospital, so I missed just loads and loads of schooling. It was one of those things I had to admit to when I was first an education minister. It's one of the first things they ask you when you first start as a minister is, where did you go to school? And I had to admit that I had a slightly strange background, a rather unusual background. But it gave me an insight, I think, into what it's like to fall behind, what it's like for things not to go well for you, to really struggle at school. And although I was very academically bright and very keen on school, things were not always straightforward for me. And I had a sense of what it's like to be an outsider. So these issues have really fired me in my political career. It really matters that you give young people the opportunities that they deserve. So in opposition, I campaigned very hard to make sure that something was key in our manifesto is a policy called the Pupil Premium, and some of you will have heard of it. And it's a policy of making sure we have extra money at school for those schools who take children from the most deprived backgrounds. And that extra money pays for all sorts of things, extra help, extra classes, after school activities. And we know that that will make a difference to those children in terms of how well they get on. And lots of other things that I was involved with as well inside government. There were things that I campaigned for in opposition and things I was able to deliver when I was in government, and I know will make a big difference to young people's lives. But perhaps the issue I'm most proud of is probably not the thing that I did in government. I mean, I was in government for 2.5 years. I'm now a backbencher again. But the thing in the last 10 years that I'm most proud of was the campaign that I worked on Guantanamo Bay. I had 2 constituents who were in Guantanamo Bay, and that was how I got involved, really, in this campaign. It was about families coming to see me to talk about their relatives. And the first of those was a more straightforward case, if you like, because he was a British citizen, and at that stage the British government were keen to bring the British citizens home. But the other gentleman was not a British citizen. He was a British resident. He was actually a Palestinian refugee with Jordanian nationality. So the British government weren't prepared at that stage to take responsibility for him. They weren't prepared to lobby the Americans to bring him home. And I got very emotionally close to the family. I got to know the family very well. He had 5 British children, one of whom had never met her father, because when he was arrested, he'd been on a brief business trip to Africa. His wife was pregnant, and he was arrested in Africa and then kidnapped by the CIA and rendered to Afghanistan, and then later on taken to Guantanamo Bay. So he'd never met his youngest daughter, and he was kept in Guantanamo Bay for more than five years. So it was an issue I became very impassioned about. I mean, it kind of almost took over my life, actually. And I worked with lawyers, I worked with campaign groups. I set up the all-party parliamentary group on Guantanamo Bay to campaign in Parliament, working with journalists. But also we worked very closely with local people. So we had local people in the constituency who ran petitions, who came and lobbied Parliament, a local paper who ran a huge campaign. And the star of that campaign, I suppose it's a message for young people really, the star of that campaign was his 9-year-old son. His 9-year-old son, Anas, was the one who really set that campaign alight. And he wrote letters to Tony Blair and then later to Gordon Brown. And he took huge responsibility on his shoulders for a very young child. He felt very conscious of the fact that as his father was not there, that he was the man of the house. And he really campaigned and led that campaign in a phenomenally courageous way. And it was his school friends who came and stood in the vigil outside 10 Downing Street, holding the candles. It was him who did a lot of the interviews with both national journalists and local journalists. It was local journalists who kept that campaign alive. And we called it Justice for Dad, because it was about making sure that a father was able to come home and be with his children. And we ran that campaign for best part of 2 years solidly. And I still remember the moment when, at that stage, David Miliband was Foreign Secretary. And I still remember the moment when he phoned me. Well, he didn't phone me. Actually, his private office phoned me to say, today, the British government changed their policy and we've written to the Americans and asked for Jamil al-Banna to come home. And still, even now, I can feel it floods me with emotion, actually. It was the most emotional moment of all my career, that I knew at that point, I knew we'd done it. And it took another 6 months of the British government negotiating with the Americans to bring him home. But just before Christmas, he came home and he walked in through his front door and he picked up his 5-year-old daughter for the first time. And it was the most amazing moment of my career. And I thought, everything that I've ever done made this worthwhile, to see one man come home.
Okay, let me ask everyone a question. How many of you here would like to live in a safe and pleasant environment? Let's have a show of hands. So all those people that would like to live in a safe and pleasant environment, raise your hands. Okay, so apart from half a dozen people, everybody would like to live in a safe and pleasant environment. That's a joke. Of course, everybody wants to live in a safe and pleasant environment. And that was the platform on which I fought the 2009 by-election. This is what I set out for my residents in my ward. But first, let me tell you a little bit about how I got to this privileged position. I don't have a background in politics. I didn't study law, economics, or even politics. I was born and raised in Lancashire. Both my parents were immigrants from India, and they came to this country in the early 1960s. My father worked in the cotton mills before he retired due to ill health. As you can see, I don't come from a privileged background. I come from humble beginnings, but I do feel very privileged, and I'm very proud of my parents' achievements. After finishing school, I decided to move to London to study engineering. I then went on to work for 2 years, and then I went into business. At this point in my life, I met my dear wife, and we decided to get married. Got 2 wonderful children, if you can still call them children, that is. One of my sons is actually studying physics at Imperial College, and my other son is studying his A-levels. I've been involved in community work for many years, and for this, my heartfelt gratitude must go to my late father, because he was a true community champion. In fact, he helped establish the very first community centre in Lancaster back in the mid-1960s, and later Blackburn in the late 1960s. My parents eventually decided to join me and move to London. And with the background my father and I had, we immediately got involved, and we helped establish the Ilford Muslim Society, which serves as a community centre and a mosque. I've been a member ever since, and I've had the honour to have served as the General Secretary for a number of years. Earlier I referred to my father as my late father. This is because eventually in September of 2007, which I remember very distinctly, as it was the very first morning of the beginning of Ramadan, in fact it was around 1:15 a.m. in the morning, I was sat beside his bed, holding his hand, at which point he passed away due to cancer. So it was a very sad and difficult time in my life, because we were very, very close. I remember some of the things he used to say to me, such as, don't worry about wealth and money, try to do things for others. Strive to be from amongst the givers and not the takers. Always be grateful for what you have. And it's not surprising, because my father had very strong values and faith. It was a time in my life when I had the opportunity to reflect, to re-evaluate my goals and my priorities for the future. The legacy my father had left behind was an inspiration for me to continue to concentrate on community work. One could say perhaps this was the turning point in my life. Through this work, I was able to pick up on issues which were of concern to people in the community. It gave me the opportunity to meet people from different communities. This is when I realised that, in fact, the issues were quite common, regardless of people's backgrounds. I could see things happening for myself. The situation wasn't getting any better. A ward controlled, as Brother Haroon has already mentioned, for decades by Labour, being complacent, and the ward councillors were not interested. It was a point at which people in the community approached me, community leaders approached me, and they asked me to stand in the 2009 by-election. So that's how it started for me. I decided to take up this challenge, and I decided to stand as a Liberal Democrat. Why did I decide to stand as a Liberal Democrat? Because only Liberal Democrats have policies which are based on local needs, fairness and justice. This was a party I could resonate with. This was a party which I felt comfortable with. This was a party which I trusted. This was a party which suited my personality and local needs which I identified. The Liberal Democrats allow freedom for members to establish policies based on local needs. These were the reasons why I actually decided to join the Liberal Democrats, not to mention the staunch opposition, in fact very staunch opposition, to the illegal war in Iraq, which was another major factor. I didn't want to end up being just another politician. My passion was to serve the local community and to help improve local services in the area, to assist individuals with their needs and difficulties, but more importantly, the whole and the all-inclusive community. I remember I only had a few weeks to prepare, and having had no political background, and to overturn 50 years of Labour majority was a huge and mammoth task. It was a week before Christmas when the campaign began in sub-zero temperatures. And every day I would go out, knocking on doors, delivering focuses through letterboxes, as Liberal Democrats only know too well. And to my surprise, people responded. They actually listened, and they were interested in what I had to say and what I had to offer. They were enthused by my passion for change and voted for me. I was elected with a considerable majority, for which I am truly grateful. And I can see some of the faces actually from Redbridge, and I'm sincerely grateful for their support over the years. What people wanted was a good campaigner who would take up issues which concerned them, to clean up the ward which had deteriorated into a fly tipper's paradise. I took up that challenge and I had the entire ward spring cleaned. I even had people's front gardens cleaned. Antisocial behaviour, drug dealing, burglaries and criminal activities was making people feel vulnerable and insecure. I took up this challenge and I addressed the issues. Today my ward has one of the lowest crime rates in the borough. In fact, Redbridge currently, in terms of crime and major crime, has significantly reduced. And I'm proud to be part of that. A year later, in 2010, residents re-elected me with an overwhelming majority because they thought that I was the person who would take up the matters on their behalf. And I was happy to take up the matters on their behalf. To amplify the reason for my success, I would like to share with you some examples of the type of support which I received. While delivering a focus one afternoon, an elderly lady opened a door. In conversation, she mentioned to me that she was a staunch Conservative. And this had been a tradition in her family for generations. I took a step backwards and wondered what was coming next. She actually surprised me. She broke that family tradition for the first time in her life, and she actually voted for Liberal Democrats. She also discovered while in conversation with her neighbour that he had also done the same. She asked me whether I would ask her the reason why. So eventually I did. And she said, and I quote, "I've been reading your focuses very carefully, word for word, over the weeks. And I found them very interesting. And I feel genuinely you're trying to make a difference. And that's why I voted for you." And I was deeply touched. During the 2010 campaign, we knocked on a door. This time an elderly Jewish lady answered. She complained about never receiving any of our focuses. We were quite surprised because we're quite careful when we're delivering our focuses. And Farik will remember this. Farik, you remember this particular incident. And while we were engaged in conversation, Farik quickly ran over to his car and grabbed the 16 focuses, came back and presented the lady with the focuses, and she gladly took them. And at the end of a very lengthy conversation, she said, "Okay, I'll vote for you." I said, "Thank you very much." She said, "No, I'll vote for you. Because throughout the entire conversation, you looked me straight in the eye. And that to me is a sign of an honest person." That was very touching. I'll give you one more example, this time of a contrasting story. While Farouk and I were standing outside a polling station, a woman came out and stopped before us, and she apologised for not voting for us. We were actually amazed, thinking, well, why would somebody who's got a secret ballot want to come up and actually admit that they didn't vote for us? She actually did vote for me in the 2009 by-election, but she didn't vote for me in the 2010 elections. And she gave a reason why. She actually said that she was under severe pressure from the unions, and this is why she apologised. And she said, "In future, I will certainly vote for you." Naturally, we thanked her for her sincerity and future support. So this was the type of support which I was receiving. I feel very privileged to have been appointed to Cabinet as part of a coalition at the end of the 2010 elections. This gave me the opportunity to serve the entire borough and not just my ward, and I'm recognised by all communities on many fronts. A person who's prepared to help residents in need. And over the last 3 years, I've been able to achieve a reduction in major crimes, abolished street drinking, established an 18-strong community police team. This is in addition to the borough police and the Safer Neighbourhood Team police. Secured extra funding and implemented a borough-wide pothole repair programme. Launched the first ever East London Rape Crisis Centre in Redbridge. Assisted in establishing community centres and places of worship across the borough for all communities. Carbon reduction, putting Redbridge at the very top of the London League table. Launched the first ever Redbridge Victims Panel. These are just some of the many examples which I've been privileged to have been able to achieve on behalf of my residents in my borough. My experience in politics has been both good and fortunate. The continued support which I receive from my residents is due to my passion and desire to serve.